Okay, folks, we're going to be in chapter 19 today, so let's review a bit first. In chapter 17, young David killed Goliath. In chapter 18, Jonathan, who's King Saul's son and heir to the throne, he becomes a close friend to David, even enters into a covenant of mutual protection with David. And as the years roll by, David advances in status and honor in King Saul's court because he was a really successful warfighter and army commander. Saul now begins to see David's success as a real threat to his own, and he gets convinced that David is setting up to seize the throne. Now, last chapter, Saul tried this covert plot to end David's life, but it just resulted in further success for David, and it became obvious, even to Saul, that the Lord was with David. But the thing with envy, in Saul's case, was just so intense that even the knowledge that God's favor and blessing was with David, even that didn't prevent him from plotting David's murder again. So let's look at verse 1. Now, Saul told Jonathan, his son, and all the servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father's trying to put you to death. Therefore, please be on guard, hide yourself. And then Jonathan spoke well of David to his father. And he said, don't let the king sin against his servant David, since he's not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been so beneficial to you. For he took his life in hand, and he struck the Philistine, that's the giant, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all of Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. So why then do you sin against the innocent blood by putting David to death without cause? And it worked. Verse 6 says that Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. So Jonathan here talked his father down from his jealous rage against David and managed to heal their relationship a bit. But the rest of this chapter tells us that David continued to crush the enemies of Israel in battle, and those successes just stoked Saul's envy and some psychotic paranoia. So eventually, Saul personally tries to kill David, and then when he fails, he sends some hitmen. David escapes the plot with the help of his wife, and he's chased out of the country by Saul, and he's in hiding. Now, David had enjoyed a decade of real success in his life, but here we are, and things are not working out. Just imagine yourself in David's shoes. This powerful national prophet, comes to your working class village when you're a kid. He comes into your family home and he selects you from among all the men of your country. He anoints you in the name of God. He declares God has installed you over king, over the entire nation. And a month later, this massive foreign invasion force, the Philistine army, they're poised to crush your nation, but you, in one-on-one combat with a terrifying giant at the head of this army, you kill that monster and you rout the invading army with slaughter all the way back to the nation, or back to the border. The nation's saved. And everybody's so grateful that you're moved into the palace, you're given a princess to marry, and you begin this rapid meteoric rise in the ranks to commander because you continue to defeat your nation's enemies in every combat encounter. So it actually says that David was the most popular individual in the whole country. You are God's golden-haired boy. But now, here you are on the run for your life and hiding in the bushes. Honestly, what would you do? Well, I know what I'd do. I'd go find that prophet. I'd ask him some pointed questions, and that is exactly what David did too. In verse 18, it says, Now David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel the prophet at Ramah, and he told him all that Saul had done to him. Yeah, that's exactly what I would do. And David was so perplexed. I bet he asked Samuel, he said, are you sure you've got the right guy? I know God knows everything. He even knows the future. He knows who's going to shoot JFK. He knows where Jim's remote control went. But in my case, maybe, in all due respect, you got some wires crossed. Is there any chance, Samuel, that you might have made a mistake? Because this is not turning out anything like you said it would. I'm sure part of Samuel's response would be, wait a minute, I just anointed you like God told me to. I didn't say it was going to be a bed of roses. You think that you missed God just because it's rougher than you expected? Now, I think there's a lot for us in David's situation. This pattern where God calls you, to a ministry or a marriage or some kind of enterprise, you just know God's in it. And you see some real initial successes. It really is working out great. Everybody agrees. And then bam, you begin to hit some potholes. You get some failure. Things are not easy like they were before. You become a discontent, dissatisfied. You begin to get some real defeat. And you just cannot help but question whether you ever heard from the Lord at all. Here's the thing. This is a routine pattern. It happens regularly and happens in so many ministries, marriages, and careers. They seem to start out with God's blessing and help, and then they founder. It is such a common pattern that it actually has a name. It's called the death of the vision. Now, this has to happen. The Lord calls us to these God-honoring enterprises, a child-raising marriage ministry, and we have some initial successes, and it really looks like God was right. I am the person for the job, but then God just seems to pull the rug out. He seems to withdraw his hand, and he allows us to kind of putter along on our own vision and skill and talent and gifting, energy, willpower, and we get to taste what it's like to labor alone under our own natural abilities, and it's not pretty. And this process is actually designed and meant by God to purify and refine that vision, to teach you reliance on God's leading and strength, to force you to dig deep for the answers in his word, and to burn into your soul this conviction that if I am going to succeed in anything worthwhile in life, it's because God's doing it through me. It is not remotely because of my own good looks and charm. It's not because I'm bringing anything to the table. It's really not good for us mortal men to enjoy an unbroken stream of easy victory and success in our enterprises. It's not good for our soul because we cannot help but just grow soft and proud. But listen, that wasn't going to happen to David. His immediate future was not bright. He was going to have to endure a great deal of trouble and seeming failure in his life. In fact, David was not going to see the inside of that palace for 20 more years. And it was God who was doing it. In fact, if you remember back in chapter 16, it says that the Lord sent an evil spirit. The Lord sent an evil spirit to Saul that instigated a whole lot of the trouble for David. Now, I know that can mess with people's theology, but listen, God's in control. And he is arranging the situations of David's life because he was personally discipling David and crafting his soul into something useful for his future destiny, a destiny that even David didn't fully understand. See, David wasn't just destined to be the king of Israel. David was destined to be a type, a foreshadowing of the ultimate victorious king, the Lord Christ. And the Lord Christ was going to come from David's lineage. Now, David did not pop out of the womb ready for this high and holy honor. So God took David in hand and forged it into his soul through the decades of trouble and trial. So to wrap it up, we don't really know what Samuel the prophet told David when David came in and poured out his complaint, right? But Samuel was old and wise. He'd been around God and his ways for 75 years now. So he almost certainly repeated the same wise advice that all the men of God have told us over all the centuries. And Paul repeats in Hebrews. I want to end with this passage, Hebrews 10:35. He says, "Do not throw away your confidence in God, which has great reward. What you really need is endurance, so that when you've done the will of God, you can receive the promise."